Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the EPC webinar on UK Resilience Lessons Digest. You're very welcome to join this webinar today. We have over 600 people signed up to listen live or to listen later. So to let you know, this is being recorded, will be shared later on and is accessible to everybody that's signed up. Please keep yourselves on mute today. You have a very supportive EPC team behind the scenes that will be managing the chat function. So if you have any thoughts, questions, comments for any of the speakers or generally, please put them in the chat and myself and colleagues will address as many of them as we can later on. That's really all I have to say, except to say a very big thank you to you all for registering. And today is going to be an exceptionally interesting and worthwhile session. So you will be glad that you have signed in today to listen to Lianna, the author of our UK Resilience Lessons Digest, and all the speakers.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for that kind introduction, and to everyone for joining us, and to our guest speakers as well. And to start us off, I'm really pleased to introduce Mark Birrell, Deputy Head National Risks in the Resilience Directorate, Cabinet Office, Central Government. And as this digestiry was titled Learning to Read Risks, it seemed very right and proper, and we were thrilled to have Mark with us to do a short keynote presentation to start the webinar off. So Mark, thank you so much for being here, and over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Lianna, for that introduction, and thank you to the EPC for hosting this event today. And good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for your interest in learning to read risks. My name is Mark Birrell, and I'm the Deputy Head of the National Risks team in the Cabinet Office. My team's remit is to identify, assess, and communicate the most serious risks facing the UK so that ministers, the resilience community, and the public can take action. We take the communicate part of that very seriously. So let me spend a few minutes talking a little bit about what we have done and also some of our future plans. But firstly, a little bit about the context. So in December 2022, the UK government published the Resilience Framework, against a background where the risks we face are getting more complex than ever before. We're reminded of this every day in the news, with both abroad, with events in the Middle East this week, and the ongoing war in Ukraine continuing to cause disruption to energy markets and supply chains, among other things, and at home as well, including everything from the frequency of major weather events through to new frontiers in things like artificial intelligence. This context has fundamentally changed the way we think about our own national resilience, and quite rightly, it has posed more questions about whether we are ready and prepared for the risks that we face. We said in the Resilience Framework that a shared understanding of risk is fundamental, and that resilience is a whole of society endeavour. To be prepared, and for our planning to be successful, we must all work together. With that in mind, we can't expect to build our national resilience if government keeps its assessments of risk locked up. So that's why, when it came to updating the National Risk Register earlier this year, we adopted a new transparent by default approach. This is a major shift. Never before have we been able to classify and publish such detailed risk information. For the first time, the National Risk Register now aligns directly with the National Security Risk Assessment, which is our internal and classified risk assessment. Also, for the first time, we've published the reasonable worst case scenario for each risk, which means that people can understand the scenarios and see the assumptions that underpin them. This is in order to support more effective planning and work with partners across all of society. Only in a very small number of cases in the new National Risk Register has information not been included for national security or commercial reasons. So what does the 2023 version of the National Risk Register tell us about the risk landscape that we face? Overall, a look at the risk matrix in the National Risk Register will tell you that there are a wide range of serious risks facing the UK, both malicious threats from malign actors who seek to do us harm, and non-malicious risks such as accidents or natural hazards. There are a number of risks included for the first time in the 2023 edition, including specific animal diseases, which each require fundamentally different responses, such as foot and mouth, African horse sickness and avian flu. We've included new space-based risks, such as disruption to space-based services or loss of positioning, navigation, and timing services. And we've included a malicious drone incident, for example, based on the Gatwick drone incident of 2018. The National Risk Register focuses on so-called acute risks, which are the discrete events which may require an emergency response from government. However, we know that the landscape is also becoming more complex with interconnected and cascading risks, and the nature of these acute risks is being influenced by wider trends. So we are further developing our understanding of these trends through what we are calling chronic risks. What we mean by this are the continuous challenges which, if left unchecked, would erode our security, economy, or society. We added some examples of these to the National Risk Register, such as climate change, risks from artificial intelligence, or antimicrobial resistance. These chronic risks and acute risks are intrinsically linked. For example, climate change is making severe weather more likely and impactful. AI is changing the nature of cybersecurity threats, and antimicrobial resistance can exacerbate the risk of infectious disease. As we set out in the integrated review refresh, the government is now establishing a new process for identifying and assessing a wide range of these chronic risks to enhance our understanding. So where next? We hope that our more transparent approach to the National Risk Register provides organizations across society and the economy with the information they need to deepen their understanding of risk and improve resilience. But publishing the National Risk Register is just the start. We want to build on this with more accessible and targeted information for the general public on risk and preparedness actions. To do this properly, we know that we need a firm evidence base. So in addition to engaging with academia and identifying lessons from recent events, next year we will be launching a nationally representative survey of public perceptions of risk and household preparedness. This will enable us to focus our efforts where they're most needed. So we have big ambitions for both our assessment of risks and our communication of risks. We want to make our risk products more dynamic, more digital, and more reflective of an increasingly complex real-world risk environment where risks don't happen in isolation. They compound, they cascade, and they interdepend. But our risk products are only effective if they are used. So we want to hear feedback from people inside and outside of government, from those in local resilience forums, from businesses, from voluntary and community groups, and everyone else. This is how we will progress the whole of society ambitions set out in the resilience framework and ultimately make the UK a safer and more resilient country. Thank you. Back to you, Lianna.
Thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciate your time and that overview there of the national risk landscape. Much appreciated. So thank you once again, Mark, for that excellent keynote and introduction. And it really takes us nicely onto the topic of Digest 3, which is learning to read risks. And the reason for the title of this was to emphasize the fact that along with assessment, which is absolutely critical, there is also something else to be said for observing, for real-time learning, and for the way that we psychologically interpret and understand and socialize and communicate the risks that we face. So I wanted to start really by just saying that and then giving an overview of the digest, as I'm aware that for some people it's still new, although amazingly next week will be the digest's first birthday, celebrating a year since the first edition was published last October. So for any who are not familiar with the digest or are coming to this for the first time, I just wanted to highlight that the UK Resilience Lessons Digest is part of a programme of work at Cabinet Office Emergency Planning College to synthesise lessons learned from all exercises and emergencies. Its purpose is anchored in the central government commitment as outlined in the UK Government Resilience Framework to summarise lessons from a wide range of relevant sources sharing learning insights consistently across the UK government and wider resilience partners. And in order to do that, it really has three key objectives, which are to summarise transferable lessons and themes from that wide range of relevant sources, to share lessons across responder organisations and wider resilience partners, and coordinate knowledge to drive continual improvements in doctrine, standards, good practice, training and exercising. So everything that comes within the digest publication will sit under one of those core three objectives. So that's a bit about the purpose. In terms of principles for what we include in the digest, we've got three guiding principles. Firstly, that lessons must be anchored into that shared understanding of risk that also underpins the national resilience endeavour. Secondly, that lessons are time sensitive but not time limited, meaning that lessons are not seen to expire or be null and void just because they could be a few years old. We know that there's always a case to remember and to relearn and revisit lessons of the past, and that any lessons analysis within it must deliver applied value in practice for resilience partners. So that's a bit about the principles. The approach we take to the digest is absolutely a partnership one in the spirit of whole society resilience. And that is why the digest is freely available, public facing from the EPC website Knowledge Hub. So if you haven't downloaded your copy yet, please do visit the website, free to download. And also you will find previous editions there, along with some slides and webinar recordings. That means that we specifically exist to complement, not compete with other important lessons and knowledge exchange work. And then in terms of the process of putting it together, analytically, we adopt some academic rigour to that to ensure we're providing evidence-based lessons. And to try and make the product accessible, we've broken the digest down into specific articles so that you can digest the whole lot in one go should you want to, but that actually it can be taken in bite-sized chunks depending on your areas of interest. So now into the third edition of the digest. There's also still plenty of potential. So do keep watching this space, keep an eye on our website or sign up for EPC Comms to hear of further work under that lessons work stream within the organisation. When it comes to putting the digest into action, we've also included these three icons, which can help direct you to metabolize what you've digested in the publication. We have some helpful sidelights, which tend to highlight key insights, academic information, or professional practice, which sheds some light on the topic being discussed in the article. We have a Make It Active icon, which suggests practical application points or things to try in your own context, and a resources icon too, which signposts to further reading and information. So to crack on in terms of what actually was included within edition 3 of the digest, Learning to Read Risks, there was a focus on lessons arising on risk from COVID-19. And I'll come into more detail about that analysis shortly. But just to give a sort of visual feel for what was included, we had the central analysis in terms of summarising those lessons. And then we were also really fortunate to have a number of guest authors and contributors giving articles looking at lessons from the review of the National Security Risk Assessment methodology, learning at Alder Hey Children's Hospital NHS Trust, also some academic insights and a bit of overview of the national risk landscape, as Mark has already outlined. along with an article from PwC around personal resilience, and also some practical tools for implementation from colleagues who very kindly have stayed up very late into the night from Australia, from Emergency Management Victoria, who'll be speaking to us later on. So in terms of the learning analysis within learning to read risks, I just wanted to highlight the meat of the analysis and the learning themes that came out so that we can understand where they've come from. And of course, I think COVID-19 really created a fundamental shift in our shared understanding of risk. And whilst a lot of the lesson identification processes continue, most notably through the COVID-19 inquiry here in the UK, publication of the new National Risk Register, the approaching winter season, and also the fact that there was some learning in hand already really prompted us to take a look at what was already there and do a sort of focused thematic review of high-level lessons on risk to date. So how did we do that and what did we find? The rationale really was to look for two things. We were looking for common learning themes, which we define as sort of patterns in the lessons identified, and in this case, recommendations as they were presented across the reports, to understand where the key sort of recurring areas for improvement or of good practice might lie. And secondly, to highlight transferable lessons, which are those lessons identified that could be applied to drive continual improvements in multiple resilience settings or across multiple hazards and threats. In terms of methodology, you can read more about that in the digest, but just to say that it was qualitative in nature, in that it looked to the written content as it appeared, allowing the reports to inform the themes directly rather than our team attempting to infer meaning from them. And the results are provided in the following slides with the additional sidelights available in the digest. So which reports have we taken these from? Well, there was a total of 52 recommendations in the top 5 learning themes. And the 4 selected reports were published in a 7-month period between September 2021 and May 2022. So quite a short period, especially compared to the 12 years worth of lessons from exercises reviewed in the previous digest. All of those lessons had a significant evidence base attached to them and represented multimodal research from the United Nations University, the National Audit Office Review of Government's Preparedness for COVID-19 Pandemic, the House of Commons Committee of Public Accounts, and the House of Lords Select Committee on Risk Assessment and Planning. It is important to note that some of these reports, given their proximity in terms of timeline, do reference each other. But although the report quantity is small, the evidence base behind each of them combined is truly vast. And we also hope, in looking at those national learning high-level lessons of particular relevance in some cases to government, that it really reflects that whole society approach to learning and looking at what local resilience partners and central government can take away from these overarching learning themes. So the top 5 themes are displayed here in order of prevalence on the diagram. And just to run through those quickly with a bit of added detail here. The first and most frequent theme that arose was around the approach to risk, that COVID had caused a very fundamental shift in the thinking about the risks we face as a society. And whilst it was clear that some people were already there in terms of thinking about systems and holistic risk assessment, there was also a certain amount of evidence that went into those reports that demonstrated we were not all there at the same time together, and that actually going forward, that assessment of risk had to move away from a siloed, departmental or intra-organisational perspective to move towards something more holistic and integrated, representative of a whole society approach, where more connections could be drawn and the cascading kind of impacts and second or third order effects of the materialization of the risk could actually be addressed in a more holistic manner. This also was sort of seen in things such as, in the international context and national context, things like the school closures, the additional impacts on education, which extended, and the risks therefore to vulnerable groups that extended beyond the sort of primary risks associated with fighting COVID-19. The second theme that came out was around assessment of risk, and so I'm really pleased that shortly I'll be handing over to Dr. Alexandra Smyth from the Royal Academy of Engineering, who has actually been leading on the review of the National Risk Assessment methodology. But it wasn't just the UK, it was coming out at the international level across the various different countries that were reviewed in the United Nations research, that actually there was something about our assessment of risk that hadn't moved at the pace of the evolving risk landscape, and that actually there was a requirement and a call for a more adaptive, agile and responsive way of assessing risk to be developed and applied. Moving on to the last three themes, it was not so surprising as well to see that risk communication was in there. And for others who've come across communication lessons frequently in many different settings, there were similar themes that there have been in other circumstances, such as the consistency of communication, the accuracy and the timeliness of information to support that key decision making process. Okay, so just to finish off there, that the risk communication challenges I was highlighting, just it sort of underscored the importance for mechanisms for timely transfer and also smoother transfer, which of course becomes inherently difficult when we've got that uncertainty. But what is good is that there were some examples of good communication, particularly at the local level through community-based mechanisms, especially in the international context. The fourth was risk leadership and management, and just to scoot through this now because I'm aware of time, but this was interesting because risk management is something that's been talked about so much, and actually what came out of these reports now was more risk leadership. And really interesting to see that shift, which is about owning the risk as a department or as an individual with key accountabilities and proactive management and mitigation, with a real sort of senior drive behind it. And it was under this theme that there were calls for greater scrutiny of risk leadership, reduction in variability in risk management strategies, and also for there to be a timeliness to that leadership interventions. Finally, very aptly, the fifth theme that came out was actually around lessons and learning. And not only did this serve the digest well, but in all seriousness really came up because of the inherent risks with not implementing change and embedding lessons after they've been identified, or not identifying them in the first place. The risk that was present after exercises where lessons had been identified but not acted on was really clear. And it seemed that whether some action had been taken and it was a learning sufficiency challenge, or whether the measurable change that had been presumed to have taken place had not been monitored or measured or evaluated, depended on the circumstance. But nonetheless, it was highlighted that wherever there was a lesson, there was a risk for the future. And that prompted the thought that actually there was something around a shift in mindset from learning when there's time to learning while there's time ahead of the next emergency or crisis. So that's the summary of the research from the central analysis. And as mentioned, I'm really pleased now to hand over to Alex from the Royal Academy of Engineering, who is going to tell us about their review of the National Risk Assessment methodology.
Thanks, Lianna. And for those of you that don't know, the Royal Academy of Engineering is the UK's National Academy for Engineering and Technology. Our fellowship spans 1,600 of the country's best engineers, and their expertise spans disciplines from AI to nuclear and the built environment. And it's my job to draw on this expertise in infrastructures and resilience to inform policymaking. So if we go to the next slide, risk management and resilience are really strong themes across the engineering profession. So in 2021, we were asked to undertake a review of the National Security Risk Assessment methodology, which I will be calling the NSRA from here on in. Immediately, we were kind of presented with the complexities of the NSRA as it went from central government out to local action. So we chose to take a systems approach to explore and unpick the complex interactions across the process. We used the question framework that you can see here to structure our approach. First, we worked with central government, devolved administrations, and the local resilience forums to understand the system, what worked well, and its pitfalls. We then looked at good practice examples in risk assessment, understanding interdependencies, and scenario building. This drew on examples in academia, from industry, and from government as well. And from these very different examples, we were able to identify some common themes which have informed our principles for good practice, which I'll get onto shortly. Finally, we made some practical recommendations to the Cabinet Office, outlining all of the considerations for implementation of the changes to be successful. These were identified from workshopping all of the recommendations with the different stakeholders involved and making sure that we understood the nuance and what was going to really make these transformative in practice. In 6 months, I think we engaged with almost 200 stakeholders to ensure that we really understood those implications and what effect they would have on the NSRA process as a whole. And I really hope that these have made a positive impact to UK resilience. I'll now talk about our principles on the next slide. So embedding resilience thinking into risk management, we believe, really helps increase preparedness for future events. The 7 key principles are on the slide here, but firstly, it's all about ensuring a joined up approach. That means building really strong relationships across typical sectoral silos to create a shared understanding of the capability that different organizations have. This join up in strategy needs to cross prevention, preparedness, and then into response and recovery, so that together, all of the different actions to create resilience are bigger than the sum of their parts. Then we've got encouraging participation and communication, and Lianna's talked about the importance of some of these areas, but I think we all recognise that we're biased by our own lived experiences, and there will be aspects of how risks might manifest for different parts of society that as individuals we may not automatically think of. It's vital that a diversity of perspectives are brought into our understanding of risk to both unpick what it might mean in practice and to provide meaningful challenge to our assumptions. Building these networks will prove invaluable when something does go wrong, because you know who's to call on and who's able to help. Our third principle is to focus on impact. While knowing how likely something is to occur can be really helpful for prioritizing action, decision-making really must be driven by impact and preparedness. Those with responsibility for managing risk should be incentivized to reduce that impact by increasing our preparedness. In fourth, we suggest exploring the interdependencies. Having lived through COVID-19, we're all acutely aware of the cascades of consequences that can occur in an emergency. Coming together is critical to uncover those interdependencies between our infrastructures, our services, and the relationships. This will help us identify the compound consequences that might result from decisions made rapidly at the time. Relatedly, our fifth principle is to consider a range of scenarios. While the reasonable worst case scenario has lots of value, considering multiple scenarios can really help with robust planning and identifying a range of different response capabilities that might be needed. It's not about scenarios for the sake of scenarios. It's about understanding where something different will be required and where the cascading risks and consequences might occur. Our sixth principle suggests embedding new data and metrics. And I think we all know data is vital for informing likelihood and impact assessments, but also for providing early warnings and in monitoring the unfolding emergency. But confidence in the data must be high. That means having data sharing agreements in place between organizations beforehand so that we can really get access to the data we need at the time we need it. That also means models need to be carefully evaluated and paired with real-world information so that we're not swayed by what the model says and we know what's actually happening on the ground. And finally, we propose reviewing based on need. Resource for risk assessment and preparedness is often scarce, so it's important it's used effectively. By reassessing risks based on need, by which I mean how sensitive those risks are to technological or societal changes, or maybe the change in provision of mitigations, rather than the kind of standard time interval, it allows the most effective use of resource and for people to engage in the process and give it deeper consideration. This might also enable longer-term planning rather than short-term fixes. And finally, on the next slide, we recognise that many of these principles aren't easy to adopt everywhere. We offer a set of questions to explore the barriers and enablers to implementing these good practice principles in your setting. These include, is the role of risk assessment broadly understood? By which we mean, can you get buy-in across the organisation for this to be more than a tick box exercise? What are the stories you can tell that really buy people into the discussion? Is the wider organisation aware of the risks identified in the assessment and any interdependencies that might sit within their responsibilities? Do you have that effective information exchange that increases awareness? Can greater cross-organisational collaboration be facilitated to better understand these risks? That will help create a sense of shared responsibility and potential for shared action. Is the organisation better prepared for the risks included in the assessment as a result? And are the risks decreasing because of improvements in preparedness or reductions in impact? If not, is that acceptable, or do actions need to be taken place? Hopefully, the answer to all of these questions is yes. But if not, maybe you can start a conversation within your organisation to start to move the practices forward. You can read more about our review in our Building Resilience report, and I'll hand back to Lianna now.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Alex. And the report is available to download on your website, I believe. Perhaps we can get a link in the chat. If not, we'll add that in. I'll add that in shortly. Now, thank you. I'm happy to move on to our next article in our presentation from Lisa Jackson and Oggy Dawson from Emergency Management Victoria, all the way from Australia, staying up late at night to share with us some of their tools for implementation and how they've learned from moved from lessons identified to lessons learned in their context. So over to you both, and thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Lianna, and hi all. I will kick off today with an acknowledgement of country, which is a tradition in Australia to acknowledge the lands on which we meet today. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or other Indigenous peoples who may be here with us today. So it's a pleasure to be joining you from Melbourne, Australia tonight, and a huge thank you and congratulations to Lianna and your colleagues for your world-class work on the Lessons Digest. It's it's widely recognised in our part of the world as best practice, and we love reading it every time it comes out, and so it's a pleasure to be included. Oggy and I are excited to run you through some key points relating to our article, but also continue the conversation after today. We both could talk about this stuff for hours, so we'll try and keep to time, but please reach out via LinkedIn or email and contact details if you do want to chat further. But just for some context, we work for Emergency Management Victoria, which is in the state of Victoria in Australia. Our organisation was established in 2014 after the significant Black Saturday bushfires in 2009 and then subsequent flooding emergency in 2010-11. And the purpose of our organisation is to bring the sector together to collaborate and coordinate effective emergency management in an all hazards, all emergencies environment. We work with approximately 50 different agencies, and that includes local government and not-for-profits and non-government agencies. So all of our lessons management work that we're talking about today is conducted in this multi-agency environment. So we'll just flick into the next slide and take you back to kind of where it all started in 2014 when the organisation was established. And we were looking at the emergency management sector, and we're exploring different lessons management approaches that were being undertaken through an environmental scan and also research as well on how to effectively support learning within the emergency management sector. So our environmental scan and research found that there was a strong culture of identifying themes and lessons, but not so much success at ensuring those lessons were learnt by creating lasting behaviour change. There was no consistent model across our agencies, which was leading to poorly defined roles, responsibilities, and expectations. Blame and shame, although had diminished, was still prevalent in many parts of our sector. And there was a lack of visibility in the process of developing lessons, leading to a perception that people's contributions at debriefs just weren't being used. Even if they were, they just weren't aware of how it was being utilised. And so even though we had many champions of learning practice in the field, there was a risk at that point of losing some momentum because of the perceived black holes of information. Emergency management agencies were working individually on lessons management, which was creating some silos of knowledge and disconnection around learning opportunities. And there was limited understanding around the principles and benefits of lessons. So using all of this information and the outcomes of the research on lessons management, we established EMLearn, which is our Victoria's first multi-agency lessons management framework, and has been released since 2015. And although it feels like yesterday, it has obviously been about 8 years, and it's been a journey of testing and refining that approach as well. And you'll hear how we've done that through a case study today. And as you'll probably appreciate, culture is often an intimidating part of lessons management, and it's often the soft element, and it's not something that you can easily touch or create a process around. And you can have the best lessons processes in the world, but without a positive and supportive culture, they will fail. So the EMLearn framework includes a life cycle, as was on screen before, which includes key characteristics of what we've been focused on implementing as part of our culture since then. So that includes having a just, fair, or no blame culture, communication, accountability, leadership, and being learning focused in everything that we do. So no blame or shame, as well as outlining a process which includes the identification through to learning of lessons. And to support the lessons management process, we utilise a national Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience lessons management methodology of observation to insight to lesson identified and lesson learned. And separating those two terms is really important to us, and I'm sure all of you as well, because a lesson is not learned until you have seen that change implemented. I won't go into the OIL methodology in a lot of detail, but essentially it's around pulling together data from individuals and their experiences at different events at any point in time, and then using coding, triangulation, and pattern recognition to bring that together. So you would use at least 3 sources of data to inform an insight, and then 3 insights to inform a lesson at a bare minimum. And that's really just to ensure triangulation from multiple sources, and we're not just reacting to the loudest person in the room. And what this does do is it allows us to have a trackable way and a transparent way of how we get from an observation through to a lesson. So we're always able to go back to that data and explain why we have the lesson that we do. But I'll hand over to Oggy to run you through the June 2021 extreme weather event.
Thanks, Lisa, and thank you, Lianna and team, for this opportunity. So I'll take you through a practical example of lessons management applied to an emergency event, as was described in the Lessons Digest. So in early June 2021, over a 4-day period, Victoria experienced destructive winds and heavy rainfall, which caused significant impact, including fallen trees, widespread damage to power, telecommunications and transport infrastructure, as well as major flooding, which left some communities completely isolated. So the Victoria State Emergency Service, which is the lead agency in Victoria for flood, storm and rescue operations, received over 10,000 requests for assistance, which made it the single largest operational event in the agency's history. So there's a few factors uniquely associated with this event that separate it from other previous or similar events. Firstly, it occurred outside of Victoria's high-risk weather season, meaning normal emergency management arrangements weren't in place. And secondly, there was great uncertainty in the prediction of the intensity and location of the weather event. Following the event, there was a public commitment made by the Minister for Emergency Services and the former Emergency Management Commissioner to conduct a review into the event. So in September 21, the Coordinated Learning Review was established, and the purpose of the review was to establish a coordinated and consistent approach for reviewing the event. It was to ensure that lessons of statewide, multi-agency significance, and also aspects of particular interest to impacted communities, which involve areas of good practice and opportunities for improvement, were identified, implemented, and shared across the emergency management sector, and importantly, with the impacted communities. So in line with the EM Learn framework, which Lisa has spoken to, the review applied lessons management principles to capture observations, analyse for insights, and to identify lessons. Through various components, over 2,000 observations were collected from impacted communities and emergency management personnel. These were then themed, analysed for patterns and trends, and developed into 369 insights. Through further analysis of the insights, we identified and developed 50 lessons that articulate a viable course of action that can either sustain a positive action or address an area for improvement. The lessons then went through a vigorous validation process with all relevant agencies and key stakeholders. This ensured that they demonstrated a collective level of sentiment across the emergency management sector. From there, we developed 2 reports. The community report, which was a public-facing report. This one was prioritised and was released 12 months after the review. It featured 11 lessons of significance to the community. To complement the release of the report, we joined the former Commissioner and senior representatives of emergency management agencies at several community visits across the state. These were organised to hear feedback from the communities in relation to the findings in the report and to communicate back to them what change has been implemented since the event, which the community really valued. Shortly after, we released a more comprehensive operational report that featured 44 lessons aimed at emergency management personnel to provide learnings back into the sector. The report itself was formulated as a case study, which included a detailed summary of the event, contextual considerations to enable that sense-making of why the event actually eventuated in the manner that it did, and a reflection of learnings since the 2010 and 11 Victorian flood inquiry, which is the last major flooding event prior to this event. Next slide, and back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Oggy. So now I'll just give you a quick rundown on the implementation approach that we applied to the lessons from the June event that Oggy just spoke to, but also the Victorian flooding event from last year that's mentioned in the article. So implementation of multi-agency lessons isn't easy, as you probably know or may have experienced yourself. And I'm yet to come across another jurisdictional country that has a process that we could steal or borrow and bring across to Australia. So if you do have one, please share it. But at the meantime, we are testing and learning from this approach that we're using that I'll run you through, but also implementing learnings from other agencies across Australia. An important thing to remember is that the lessons aren't recommendations, so we don't tell our stakeholders how to fix the issue or sustain the good practice, so it's left up to the subject matter experts to consider the lessons and plan a way forward. And often work is already underway that can be informed by the lesson as well. But the ultimate goal is to ensure that the right people have the right lessons at the right time, so they can then use them to inform their programs and projects, operational decisions and planning processes, with the end state being that we can say hand on heart that we've learned and give our personnel and community comfort that their experiences matter and have informed change. So what we did with the June lessons and the Victorian flooding event lessons was each lesson was categorised as either strategic, operational, agency specific. And that was really just a way for us to be able to say, can this lesson at the moment be tackled with the current resourcing and funding that we have available to us, or do we potentially need to go to government and seek further funding and resources to support that moving forward? Or is the lesson specifically relating to an agency and their sole responsibilities? And so that was the first kind of cut of the lessons, was to be able to divide those lessons up in that way, and then do an assessment around what other work is underway. So what other strategic work might be happening in response to other recommendations and lessons that have come out of maybe external inquiries and the like. And the last step was then to think through who the lead agency or committee should be. And this was all in consultation with our sector as well. We don't operate as an independent authority around this work. We definitely work side by side with our partners. We also had significant engagement from our Emergency Management Commissioner and our other senior stakeholders from the agencies throughout this work. And we were able to get a really high level of engagement and get letters sent from our Emergency Management Commissioner directly to lead agency chiefs to be able to say, you know, these lessons have now been finalised and approved in consultation with your agencies, and we now hope to see that you've considered those, and we want to have conversations into the future about what's been done to either implement the lessons or consider those in your pieces of work. And that really highlighted to us that executive engagement is just so critical in terms of getting other agencies and stakeholders on board and really being able to effectively learn from lessons moving forward. And as you can imagine, measuring change is a critical component in being able to understand if you have learned a lesson. And this step focuses on confirming the success or the outcomes of lesson learning and involves measuring, reporting, and validation through either exercising, training, or future operational activities, where we use a function such as real-time monitoring and evaluation that you can see on screen. So just a quick overview of what that capability is. It's a state-level multi-agency program that's been in existence for more than a decade in our state. Unlike traditional evaluation, often conducted post-events, we conduct real-time monitoring and evaluation during the readiness, response, relief, and early recovery phases of an emergency. It involves short deployments of a group of operational and evaluation subject matter experts who observe meetings, debrief personnel, and review documentation while the event is underway. And they capture details that could have been missed if an evaluation was done after the event. The approach promotes a no blame, just and fair culture and supports real-time learning by collecting, analysing and disseminating learnings all within the 4 to 6 day deployment, and provides a platform to escalate issues quickly. The RTM&E program is also used to monitor change and improvement in real time to ensure lessons are being captured, implemented and learned from previous events, as we can focus the terms of reference of the deployment on previously identified lessons, or deploy multiple times during one event to check to see if things have changed or moved. So we will leave it there. I'm conscious of time, but thank you for giving us the time tonight to share our experiences. And there's so much more we could talk about, but please do reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Oggy. So appreciated and so fascinating. Please do, as we carry on now, put any links in the chat to, I know you've got some fantastic publications that relate to that, but really excellent. Thank you so much. Aware of time, I'm just going to pass straight on now to Dr. Sarah Robertson, who is going to talk about developing and delivering the Ground Truth tool in Alderhay Children's Hospital. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Lianna. And I'll just spend the next 5 minutes telling you a bit about our learning through the pandemic. So my name's Sarah Robertson. I'm a clinical psychologist that works into the Staff Advice and Liaison Service, a one-door service for all of our staff within the organisation to offer listening, advice and support. And also I have a split role into organisational development, thinking about strategy and processes. And I'll be talking about the Ground Truth tool and work that was supported by the wider team, as you can see listed on this slide. And our service is led by Joe Potier. So the next slide just talks a bit about why it was so important for us to think about a new approach and why we implemented the Ground Truth tool. So in COVID-19, just to set the scene for you, whilst Alderhay Children's Hospital supports children, our staff were asked to respond to the national crisis around COVID-19 by caring for adults. And there are risks inherent in healthcare work for staff due to the nature of the work anyway. There's a unique emotional and psychological burden associated with care, but this was really exacerbated by a very unpredictable and volatile context where leaders were faced with high risk of moral injury in making decisions about what to do and how to respond best. And the amount of trauma exposure in the role was very high, and people were affected by what they saw and heard. The amount of secondary and vicarious trauma meant that our workforce were at an increased risk of trauma saturation, whilst continuing to work and respond with an uncertainty as well about COVID-19 and how it might impact. And at the same time of that, there was a reduction in the protective factors in the workplace, in the fact that people were separated due to infection control measures, teams were disconnected, redeployed, there was more isolation, and it was hard for leaders to understand the reality on the ground as people were working more digitally. And there was also the aspect that staff were living the experience as well as caring for people through the experience. So we saw a huge rise in burnout in the NHS, and there was a widening gap between demand and resources, which has continued as we've kind of out of the peak of the pandemic, but are now recovering the backlog of services. So it's no wonder really that there's a spotlight on focusing on mental health and the need for sort of proactive, preventative support. Whilst there's limited options externally, we know we need integrated systemic approaches, because actually isolated approaches for stress management with psychologists have little to no effect on stress management in the workplace and can increase turnover, whereas we need to keep people going and caring. So the next slide, we talked about a novel approach really to a worsening problem. So these things were risks pre-pandemic, but as I've said, had worsened throughout the pandemic. And so we reached out to the ground truth team at the University of Liverpool and deployed a digital mechanism which is focused on the cognitive and behavioural principles behind keeping going, building resilience. So supporting adaptive recovery, helping people to stay well and reflect, come together and offered a structured framework through talk, review, understand, tell and heal. So looking at offloading, reviewing live responses, what had been learned, who needed to be told, and feeding this back to leaders whilst actively monitoring stress so that people could respond with solutions. So on the next slide, I'm just going to talk about some of our key learning, because what we found with the ground truth tool is that staff, 95% of staff found it helpful, and 47% of staff reported feeling better, and only 2% of staff reported feeling worse, which is less than typical therapy as well. And what we found critical really in this environment and is part of our service model is that we need to target interventions for wellbeing at all within the organisation to normalise distress and reduce stigma and support early intervention. And in that, integrating the dual responsibilities between individuals and organisations is paramount so that everybody takes accountability for what they can do and has enhanced awareness about what difference they can make to reducing stress as proactively as possible. And it's supporting leaders with a framework that enables them to respond in a helpful way, in a focused way. And it's this idea that it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. So supporting as much compassion within the organisation and doing that through networks of noticing. So within SALS, we have SALS pals who are trained on the ground using the ground truth tool to notice, and having those local contacts help to maximise trust and minimise the stress, whilst feeding back key insights to leaders so they've got that enhanced situational awareness and can respond in a helpful way. So I'm happy to talk about it more with anyone that's interested. If you can email me, I'll finish there so that we've got time for the last speaker. But thank you so much, Lianna, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you ever so much. That was fascinating. And please do continue to put Q&A in the Q&A box as we continue. There's a short poll coming up which you can fill in as we continue, but I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Claudia van der Heuvel to speak to us now from a crisis leadership perspective around personal resilience. Claudia, over to you.
Thanks so much, Lianna. I will keep this as short as I possibly can, everyone. I'm so conscious of time. The first slide I'll whiz through. So this is really just to set the scene as to why I think crisis leadership is so essential nowadays. But I feel like all the speakers that have come before me have really set the scene really nicely, right? Mark kind of set the scene already about the state of the world outside, the fact that we are living in a perma-crisis and poly-crisis world. And that is why they were the new words in the dictionary in 2022. I don't think I need to labor this point because I feel like I'm preaching to the choir just a little bit. And interesting to hear Sarah talk about the levels of burnout, specifically in the NHS. But I think this is pertinent to all workforces across the UK and across the world probably. And I think it's especially pertinent to those who are in leadership positions because they're at the heart of all emergency response. So the fact that we're having situations, these unique crises that are both deeply rooted in mega trend crises as well as those sudden onset emergencies that we're having to deal with all at the same time, means that leaders nowadays are facing a really, really different operating environment. And what that really means is that we need to equip them with a whole new specific skill set so that they can learn to lead in these times. I'll spend a little bit of time on the next slide actually, because we all know that, of course, in a crisis, those day-to-day aspects of leadership become far more complex, right? Things like setting strategy, making decisions, managing a team, they're so much more challenging when a situation is rapidly unfolding, when information is incomplete, when we've got the internal and external pressures mounting, both the micro stressors and those macro impacts that we're dealing with. And I think lessons have recently really illustrated that if we're going to be able to manage through this new world that is typified by a permanent polycrisis, we just do need to equip leaders with really specific mindsets and skills to operate effectively. And at the core of that is really leaders needing to cultivate what I call personal resilience, or what is called personal resilience. But doing so really requires a stark rethink of what personal resilience even is, and then how it contributes to our ability to think clearly and perform effectively under prolonged periods of pressure and stress. So how do we build it? How do we maintain it sustainably during these periods of challenge and of pressure? And how do we encourage others around us to build it? And historically, of course, resilience has been seen to be about people coping with challenge, change, adversity, keeping going, perseverance, grit, just keep going more. Nowadays, when I talk about personal resilience, I look at how individuals set achievable and sustainable patterns of behavior so that they can optimize their health, optimize their energy and their minds. And ultimately, it's all about their ability to continue to perform despite the uncertainty faced, despite the pressure they're under. As a sort of a metaphor, I guess we can learn a lot from professional athletes around this. I mean, it is part of their job, right, to set these high performance routines. They have very specific patterns and systems to warm up and prepare for the day ahead, physically, emotionally, cognitively, to prepare for the challenge, the game, whatever it might be. Then they have ways of working patterns to perform with focus and think clearly, think broadly, reframe problems and challenges. And then they have whole ways and patterns and systems to wind down, to make sure they recover and they recharge at the end of every day or after every session that they've performed. We too can implement these day-to-day routines so we can help raise our performance capability or resilience baselines. But I think equally for crisis leaders, we need to think about realistically, what does this mean for maintaining high performance when in a crisis response, especially those prolonged crisis response programs such as COVID-19. I know that due to the time pressure in a crisis, it's so hard to think strategically and set really effective long-term strategies at the beginning of a crisis or an incident. We have this innate human tendency to just jump in and give it all, and we'll only think about the consequences to our own mental health or our well-being or actually our performance later down the line, at which point we're borrowing energy from future days. Which is why it's so much more important and critical to set that personal operational rhythm for yourselves as leaders at the beginning, very early on in a crisis. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the concept of battle rhythms or operational rhythms to get the latest information, to inform situational awareness. This builds on that same principle, right? Whether it's setting an A and a B team at the start of a crisis, sending half your people home so that they're fresh as a daisy and can't come back in, or whether it's setting daily working rhythms and patterns that you know you can keep to, which are sustainable for the long term. So this is what I call our minimum viable product high performance routine. So what are those patterns for ourselves? What are the behaviors that we can stick to in order to manage our own personal resilience, even when we're under immense pressure and working long hours? What are your personal non-negotiables? And defining those for yourself clearly at the beginning of a crisis. Again, they're deeply personal, right? So whether it's a 10-minute walk per day in daylight, or whether it's making sure you eat only nutritious foods instead of eating pizza out of a box at midnight, or making sure you have 20 minutes to wind down before bed, or making sure you get 6 hours of undisturbed sleep, it's completely up to the individual. But it's important to define them early on. What are those non-negotiables? What will you prioritize in these time compressed and challenging periods? What rhythms can you set to meet them? And ultimately, the most important part is defining how are you going to hold yourself accountable so that you can maintain them. We are all in control of our own behaviors, but it's a lot easier to trust a process that's already ingrained into our daily habits than it is to trust intention when times are tough. And these routines are important not just from a physical and mental health perspective. There's a real clear correlation to all of the other aspects of crisis leadership that you see in that wheel as well, right? Because when we are feeling more resilient and more in control, we are better able to think clearly under pressure, to think strategically, to make decisions, to communicate impactfully to those around us. So enhancing your own personal resilience will have a knock-on effect on your ability to do all these other things in the wheel. I'll spend 1 minute on this last slide because I know we've already run over, and thank you for those who are bearing with me and are still on the call. I'll just sum up with 2 takeaways actually from this slide. First of all, this is a big ask because also as leaders, we're not just having to think strategically, make decisions, set the rhythms. We're also tasked with being the emotional barometers for the team, for setting this culture that is conducive to them being resilient and holding themselves accountable from a resilience perspective as well. And there's 8 very difficult skills in that wheel set. So you can't do it alone, right? And you really need to surround yourself with the support and the expertise that you need. Cast your nets wide, seek support from a large pool of people, build on everyone's strengths, and make sure that there is that culture of psychological safety, of empathy, of bi-directional trust, and critically of hope within your teams. And finally, how can we do this? How can we get these patterns ingrained? I'm this really firm believer that muscle memory happens only through very frequent exposure. You don't learn to play the violin by practicing it once a year for 3 hours. So crisis exercises are great, but doing it once a year for 3 hours is not enough. We have to keep building our muscle memory. So the micro exercise is a great way to rehearse your crisis response processes, but it's also to hold yourself accountable to your daily routines. And again, that will shift you away from that true intention piece that you have to rely on at the beginning of a crisis response to something that's already there. It's in the muscle memory, and it will allow you to take that step back, to lead, to think clearly, to make decisions, and then ultimately lead well through challenging times and crises. I'll end it there. I'm so sorry I ran over, but thank you so much for having me today.
Claudia, thank you. That was excellent. A really clear and thought-provoking talk, and the running over is on us entirely. So I'm so pleased that you could share that with us, and thank you for those who have stayed online for the extra time. There are some polls coming up. We did have some time for a Q&A panel, but I'm aware that time has has beaten us. In terms of questions, I'm just going to pick up one that I noticed in the Q&A box and chat, which was around those good practice principles for LRFs in the local setting. And I would direct you to the link to the Building Resilience report that Alex has popped in the chat. And also in terms of the digest, in there you will find a bank of transferable lessons which pull out specific lessons and recommendations from those high-level reports that can be applied in the local setting. So some additional resources there for relevance in your own local context. But for now, I would like to thank EPC for hosting, thank Cabinet Office colleagues for joining us and supporting, and of course, thank all of our guest speakers for their wisdom, for their input, for their time, for staying up at night, and for putting their links to further information in the chat. This has been the Digest 3 webinar, Learning to Read Risks, and thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.